In our previous message together, we concluded looking at earthly or worldly wisdom. And so today, with James' help, I want us to understand the characteristics of godly wisdom or heavenly wisdom. Now, some of you may remember a comedian by the name of Jeff Foxworthy. He released his first comedy album back in 1993 entitled You Might Be a Redneck If. Now, again, this album was released in 1993, which means that if you listen to it, you're getting old, right along with me. In fact, you're old if you know what an album is, right? And in his original list, he included the following characteristics of a redneck. For example, you might be a redneck if you ever cut your grass and found a car. You might be a redneck if your fur coat is homemade. You might be a redneck if you ever hit a deer with your truck on purpose. One more. You might be a redneck if you don't think these are funny. Now, the point is simple. How do you know what a person is like? Well, you just watch him or her. Go over to their house or job. Follow them around for a while, and you'll find out exactly what they're really like. In the same way, James doesn't want us to be confused about what true wisdom is. And so he says to us, you know, you're a wise person if. And James seems to know how easy it is to misunderstand what he's been saying to us all along. So he wants to make sure that we get this right. You know, it's kind of like the man who, knew his wife's birthday was coming up. And so he asked her, he said, without, trying to appear too obvious, he said, honey, if you could have just one wish for your birthday, what would you want? So, she thought for a moment, and then she laughed a little bit and said, I'd like to be 8 again. And so he thought to himself, that's perfect. I know exactly what I'm going to do. So on the morning of her birthday, he gets her up and off they went to IHOP for breakfast. And after a huge waffle with strawberries and whipped cream, they drove to a nearby theme park. I mean, what a day it was for the two of them together. I mean, can you imagine this? He put her on every ride in the park, including the double ring Ferris wheel. 5 hours later, she staggered out of the theme park with her husband. Her head is reeling and her stomach is churning. And then off to McDonald's they go, where he orders her a Big Mac with fries and a thick chocolate milkshake. And then, to top it off, he took her to the latest Disney movie where they had popcorn, beverages, and a bag of M&Ms to just top off their day. I mean, it had been a full day of fabulous 8-year-old adventures. And so exhausted, she stumbled into the house late that evening with her husband, and she literally collapsed on the bed. And so he leaned over and he softly whispered in her ear, well, you got your wish. How did you like being 8 again? Well, she opened one eye, looked at him, and she moaned, I meant my dress size. Now, I told you that because it's one thing to think we heard what our wives said, but it's another thing to have actually understood what they did say. Well, in the last paragraph of chapter 3, James has contrasted the wisdom of the world with the wisdom of God. And James doesn't want anybody saying, oh, I thought you said wisdom was like this, and I thought you meant that instead. So in these last few verses, he'll make sure we understand and that we truly hear exactly what he's been saying. And he's effectively going to say, you know you're a wise person if. And James will provide for us these characteristics or marks of genuine godly wisdom so that we can't miss it or misinterpret what he's saying. Now, let's go back and start reading at verse 13 and get sort of a running start as we begin to work our way towards finishing up this paragraph about heavenly or godly wisdom. Verse 13, James says, who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you harbor bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. Literally, James is saying there is confusion and corruption everywhere. Now we pick up with our study today in verse 17. And James says, but the wisdom from above, meaning God's wisdom or heavenly wisdom, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. These are 7 characteristics of wisdom, and we could call them 7 marks which reveal whether or not we're really developing godly wisdom or heavenly wisdom in our lives. Now, the first word is found in verse 17, or characteristic, the first mark. And it says that heavenly wisdom or godly wisdom is pure. Notice again, James says, but the wisdom from above is first pure. And the words first pure do not mean, by the way, that this is the first word in the list. What it really means is that this is the mark of wisdom, godly wisdom, which must come first. In other words, purity is of first importance in our lives. You see, the word pure refers to moral integrity and holy living. It's the opposite of the world's wisdom. You might remember in the previous verse, the world's wisdom is described as confusion and corruption. Verse 16 says disorder and every evil thing. It's demonic. You see, my friends, the wisdom of this world is sensual, it's criminal, demonic, it's depraved, and it's devious. And James tells us that heavenly wisdom is just the opposite. It's first and foremost morally clean. You see, this word refers to someone who backs away from pollution of any kind. They treat sin, like you treat your big garbage can, right? Or container. You don't put them in the middle of your living room. You keep them outside or in your garage. Have you ever had the experience of a bag of trash ripping open and stuff falls out everywhere? I mean, everything spills out. From broken glass to eggshells to food scrappings, you name it. You've all had that wonderful experience at some point in your life, right? I know I have, more than once. And when you go to pick that stuff up, you don't even want to use your hands. And you try to pick it up, with just the tips of your fingers. Why? Because it's nasty. It's gross. And you find yourself, while doing it, crinkling up your nose because it stinks, and you back away as much as you can when you get around garbage like that. Well, that's the idea of this word that's used by James here. He says a wise person grows more and more disgusted with the filthiness of sin. He or she doesn't coddle it, they don't embrace it or defend it, they don't promote it, they don't cover it up, they don't accommodate it in their life, and they don't entertain it or even delight in being around it. You see, to the person who's maturing and developing in godly or heavenly wisdom, sin becomes more and more polluted and repulsive to them. Why? Because they're growing more and more pure spiritually and developing a godly relationship with the Lord. So James puts this word pure first in the list of characteristics or marks. And that's because every characteristic or mark, every adjective or description of heavenly wisdom which follows in this list of 7 is hinged to this first word, pure. In other words, let me put it this way. If you don't really want to be pure, if you don't hate sin and want to be clean and pure in your life, then never mind about being peaceable or gentle or merciful or any other characteristic or mark in this list. You see, if you and I get purity wrong, then we're not even on the right path to finding or much less demonstrating godly or heavenly wisdom in our lives. And by the way, this happens to provide the very first guideline to use when we're determining what is wise and what isn't for us to do. Is it pure? Should I do this? Is it pure? Is it clean? And is it right for me as a believer, as a Christian? We don't need to go to God and say, Lord, I really need your wisdom about, whether or not I should pay my taxes this year. April, is just around the corner, so Lord, would you give me wisdom about paying my taxes? We don't need to ask him that. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to be faithful to our spouse. We don't need to ask him that question. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to tell the truth. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to obey our parents. We don't need to go and ask him if whether or not it's wise to control our appetite so we can be healthy. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to put filters on our computer if we struggle with pornography. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to clean up our language and speak and talk appropriately. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to stay out of clubs and environments which aren't good for us to be in spiritually. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to keep our promises. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to be honest with our employer. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to write our own term paper if we're a student. We don't need to go and ask him whether or not it's wise to pay for whatever it is we get from a store. You never have to go to God and say, I really need wisdom for all that stuff. Why don't you need to go ask? Because none of those things are right and clean and pure, and we know they aren't. So we don't need to waste our breath asking God for wisdom as to whether or not we should be doing them. You see, godly wisdom will lead you to back away from impurity. And you'll not even really want to touch it, much less pray about it, because you know that to do it is absolutely wrong and impure. A woman who was single, true story, and had been involved with a married man for some time, finally broke off their illicit relationship. And they both claimed to be Christians, believers, and were actually involved in a church. Of that relationship, their relationship together, this woman said, and I quote, "I was so off the path of wisdom and I was so self-deceived that we could actually meet at a hotel room, get out our Bibles, read the Word of God together, get on our knees, and actually pray together before committing adultery. You see, we don't need to pray about some things. We know what we need to do and what we should do already. And if what we believe to have received from God is truly heaven's wisdom, godly wisdom, it will always then be pure, and it will always, and I mean always, be the right thing to do in our lives. So the Christian who wants to grow up in wisdom can ask this very simple question regarding their thoughts, their words, and their actions. And here it is. While I am thinking that, or saying that, or seeing that, or doing that, am I pure? When I am thinking that, saying that, seeing that, or doing that, am I being pure? That really says it all, doesn't it? That's why James says that this characteristic of purity must come first. God's wisdom is first of all pure. And it simply means it's clean. It's morally right. Well, this is where we're going to end it for today. We'll continue looking at how James describes this heavenly wisdom in our next message together as we look at these characteristics or marks of godly wisdom.